Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. Good afternoon. I'm Director Michael Rallings, Director of the Memphis Police Department. I'm also a 30-year veteran of the United States Army and Army Reserve. I also am a competitive pistol and rifle shooter. I also taught the carry permit course and armed security for the state of Tennessee. And I'm a lifetime member of the National Rifle Association. So I'm here on behalf of the Memphis Police Department, but I'm also speaking to you as a veteran and an individual who believes in supporting the Second Amendment. I am not against guns. I am against illegal guns and guns being used to kill and harm kids and kill law-abiding citizens. As I stated, I fully support the Second Amendment, but we face the challenge of managing the coronavirus pandemic across the state and across the world, and the last thing Tennessee needs is gun legislation that will allow for permitless or constitutional carry of handguns, either concealed or unconcealed without a permit. You heard General Gibbons talk about that we have an outstanding permitting system. We should leave that system alone, which requires training, which I have conducted, and also background checks to legally carry a gun. I'm fully aware that the proposal will also stiffen the penalties for stealing a gun. That is great. But for those who have lost their life to gun violence, they cannot be brought back. Children that have been senselessly killed by gun violence will never go to school or come home to see their parents again. No penalty, jail time, or reforms will ever bring those men, women, and children back. As stated by Memphis Mayor Jim Strickland, in a time when mass shootings have skyrocketed across our country, the thought of allowing people to openly carry a gun without a permit or proper training takes us in the wrong direction. Now, this statement was made in February before the coronavirus pandemic. Now, we are mandating, and many of you are wearing masks. And if this legislation is passed, not only will we be wearing masks, but many individuals will be wearing a pistol on their hip. And as you heard from General Gibbons, law enforcement would not be able to stop and ask them to present a permit, as we currently have a permitting system. In Memphis, we are challenged by violent crime. Violent crime is up 5% this year. Murders have increased by almost 30%. Aggravated assaults and shootings are up almost 8%. Robbery business are up 10.3%, and carjackings almost 10%. This is not the time for permitless carry in Memphis or in Tennessee. This is a great time to focus all of our attention on defeating the coronavirus. While I appreciate some aspects of this legislation, like increasing the penalty for gun theft and raising the age to 21, this legislation makes Memphis less safe and our police officers more vulnerable. Here are a few bullet points I want you to consider. We already have a process to carry guns in Tennessee. Last year in Memphis, 16 kids were victims of homicide. 11 of the 16 were killed by gunfire. This year, 14 have been killed, 12 by gunfire. In 2019, 88% of the murders were committed by individuals who chose to use a firearm. Of the 85 murders this year, 77 were committed with a firearm. Passing the law to allow guns in cars was the foundation for the possibility of permitless carry in Tennessee.
Director Rallings, I apologize for interrupting, but we do want to just try to keep it balanced for everybody that 4 minutes has elapsed.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that testimony. I also want to thank you for your service to our country in the Army and also in law enforcement, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Any questions for our witness? Leader Camper, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Rallings, thank you for being here. Appreciate your testimony and your commitment to this issue. You and I have talked before about the impact the guns in the cars had in Memphis and Shelby County. Could you talk more about, explain the impact that had on our everyday citizen when that law went into effect?
Director Rallings, you're recognized.
Thank you. That's a great question. So guns in cars, or the ability to carry a gun without a permit in a car, passed around 2013. Since that time, 6,146 guns have been stolen from cars. That is and so what we think that's done is put more guns in the hands of would-be criminals. We see that juveniles wake up and they go pull door handles looking for guns that are in cars, which puts guns in their hands, and we think our rise to violent crime in Memphis has been mostly attributed to easy access to guns by individuals that, you know, have no legal right and are not even old enough to possess those. 1,084 guns were stolen from vehicles in 2019. And we talk about enhancing penalties, well, only 69 of those guns have actually been recovered. So to increase penalties, you have to catch that would-be criminal. And you talked earlier about individuals not paying penalties and fines, so I think that's an issue. One of my major concerns with the legislation is that with the permit system, individuals have to prove that they're 21, they're a U.S. citizen, they have to pass a background check, and they have to have training. Well, I've trained hundreds of individuals. I've ran the firearms training program for the Memphis Police Department for 10 years. In my 30 years of military experience, I've trained thousands and thousands of service members. And to think that an individual can just, you know, go get a permit and carry a firearm without any training is irresponsible, because someone is going to lose their life accidentally. And we can correct that by at least having training. The other issue is, you know, under the current system, law enforcement can at least stop an individual and require that they show or present their permit. Under this new legislation, I don't see any language in there that will, one, require them to have any, there's no way for law enforcement to know if that person is not a prohibited person if they can't stop them. I don't know if there's any, I don't think there's any language in there where you have to carry an ID. So I think there needs to be a lot of work, and I think one of my major asks is that we push this off. Let's deal with the coronavirus pandemic and push this off to next session and give us more time to consider some of these things.
Leader Camper, you're recognized for follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you see that, or have you thought about the impact this would have on law enforcement as they're out in their just normal patrols, and they see more people with weapons? You have more weapons on the street. Have you all thought, you know, the impact that would have on law enforcement?
Director Rallings, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There has been considerable discussion about that. And I can tell you in Memphis, in Shelby County is the largest county. Memphis is the largest police department in the state of Tennessee. And unfortunately, Memphis, and my entire career, has been challenged by violent crime. So we know that when you put this deadly mix, more guns, more individuals having access to guns that are acting out violently, and you think about just the number of interstate shootings that we've had, where Tennessee Highway Patrol has been asked to come into Memphis at least 3 times for Operation Grizzly Bear, 1, 2, and 3. I have officers poised all around the interstate, because we know that when you think about Memphis being one of the distribution centers, 70+ million people are traveling through, and we have to protect them from being shot. So more guns, I've never seen it equal less crime. So our prediction is, with more people carrying guns, more guns will be stolen, more guns will fall into the hands of would-be criminals, and therefore make Tennessee less safe. If you go back to what Commissioner Gibbons talked about, and Tennessee, #1 for accidental shooting of children, 3rd most dangerous state when you look at the FBI Uniform Crime Report, 4th for firearm mortality and homicide for people under the age of 19 in their CDC data, 5th for women murdered by men, according to the Violence Policy Center, 7th in firearm mortality, and 8th for African-American homicide. I do not think that this passing of a constitutional carry, a permitless carry, will make Tennessee even more safe. I think will make it less safe.
Thank you, Director Rawlings. Leader Camper, do you have any follow-up? Okay. Next on my list, I have Representative Mitchell. Representative Mitchell, you're recognized.
Yeah, Director, I appreciate you being here today. So in some of your high crime neighborhoods, you know, when a crime occurs and your officers go out there and they try to get witnesses to speak up and tell people what they've seen, do you think this permitless carry is going to help the perpetrators of those crimes intimidate those communities even more than they already do from speaking up and being a witness to some of these crimes?
Director Rawlings, you're recognized.
I think that's an excellent point. So, I mean, if you picture this, if you think that, unfortunately, we are overrepresented in homicides. So we know that, and General Gibbons knows that we have witnessed intimidation. We know that individuals already stand out looking at individuals, and I can only imagine them standing out armed with their handguns if they're able to carry a gun, and therefore intentionally intimidating the witness. And so I think it would really put a chilling effect on those that want to come forward and help us when they know that individuals are roaming the streets that have guns. And so with masks and guns, it almost would appear to be the Wild Wild West, and I definitely do not want that for Memphis, and I do not want that for the state of Tennessee.
Representative Mitchell, you're recognized for follow-up.
So you've talked about the guns and cars. So do you think, I've heard many arguments that this is to make Tennessee safer, this constitutional carry. Do you think our time would be better spent in this committee, increasing penalties for people who leave their guns in a unlocked car, or passing constitutional carry? What would make people of your city safer?
Director Rawlings, you're recognized to answer the question.
So that's a tough question. I do not want to penalize law-abiding citizens. What we encourage our citizens to do is be a responsible gun owner. If you're going to carry a gun and you're going to leave it in a car unattended, at least try to lock the gun in some type of lock box, use some type of cable lock system, practice some better ways to make sure that that gun will not fall into the hands of a child or a would-be criminal.
Representative Mitchell, you're recognized.
Do you think if this legislation is passed, it's going to endanger the lives of your men and women on your force?
Director Rawlings, you're recognized.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Mitchell. Next up, I have Representative Beck. Representative Beck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Rawlings, for being with us today. In a scenario where if this bill becomes law enforcement pulls over a car for speeding, the person inside the car has a gun, can law enforcement, do they have the ability to find out if that person is mentally defective or been adjudicated mentally defective?
Director Rawlings, you're recognized.
Yeah, great question. So currently we do not have access to that particular database. I think only the TBI and FBI would have access to that particular information. But we can find out if someone's a convicted felon, and they would therefore be prohibited. So there are some things we can check. But if you think about a permitless system, we're not just talking about individuals driving around with a gun, because guns in cars allows individuals with nefarious intent to drive around with a carload of guns. That's already one problem. We think this will be exacerbated by now allowing individuals to walk around with a gun without some type of permit.
Representative Beck, you're recognized for follow-up.
Last statistic, there are about 55,000 mentally defective Tennesseans. So under this law, if you came to one who was being belligerent or other reason to see if he could have a firearm, you would not, there's no way for your department or any other department across the state to find out if they're mentally defective.
Not,
Director Rollins, you recognize.
yeah, not to my knowledge.
Does this
Representative Beck.
put the officer in harm's way?
Director Rollins.
Yes, it does.
Representative Beck.
Thank you very much.
Next on the list, I do have Leader Lamberth. Leader Lamberth, you recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of questions, and thank you again for your service and for your service to our state and our country before that. To the previous question from my esteemed colleague from Davidson County, if you pull over a vehicle right now, I think your answer is you don't have access to that database. And in large part, this bill changes nothing about that encounter because in a vehicle, you already do not have to have a permit, correct?
Correct.
Director Rollins.
Correct.
Just like on a boat or on a motorcycle or in your home or in your business or in your friend's house or business or in your friend's vehicle, correct?
Director Rollins, you recognize.
You are correct, but with the carry permit system, we know that if an individual presents a carry permit, that individual has a background check, and although the Memphis Police Department does not have access, TBI has access. And so the background check is what's critical. So if you included language in the bill that required a background check, we will be 100% for it.
Leader Lamberth, you recognize for follow-up.
Again, to be clear, sir, the question asked earlier was if one of your officers stopped a vehicle and the occupants of those vehicles you had to check, they're not required to have a permit now, and nothing in this bill changes anything about the scenario you just went through with the good representative from Davidson County, correct? This bill doesn't affect that scenario.
Director Rollins.
I can only go off of what you're saying. Again, we will not be able to look at an individual and know if they were mentally defective.
Leader Lamberth.
And so what I'm saying is that's a problem that we should solve across the board, whether they're in a vehicle or anywhere else. I'd like you to have access to that information, quite frankly. But the representative had asked you if someone is stopped in a vehicle. This bill deals with a carry permit, which I'm sure you know, I mean, your officers enforce this every day, deals with someone carrying outside of their home, outside of their business, outside of their vehicle. You were asked if someone is stopped in a vehicle. I'm just trying to make a clarification here that this bill doesn't in fact have anything to do with that interaction with the public because they're in a vehicle where they already don't have to have a permit, correct?
Director Rollins.
The law still says that a prohibited person cannot carry. So if you talk about, if we knew that individual, say for instance, if the Memphis Police Department makes thousands and thousands of calls with mental consumers. So if I think that, they're astronomical numbers, somewhere around 26,000 calls a year. So our officers know some individuals that have been deemed mentally defective. So there are some circumstances and instances where a law enforcement officer could stop an individual, recognize that individual as a mental consumer who has been deemed by the courts or is prohibited, and know that they're not able to carry a firearm. So I can't agree with you that in all circumstances that's going to be applicable.
Leader Lamberth, you recognize for follow-up.
Thank you. You mentioned accidental shootings. In your experience and decades of experience, quite frankly, it sounds like in law enforcement, are most accidental shootings either in the home or on personal property, or are they out on a public street?
Director Rollins.
So there's a number of them, and so without going through each one of them, I can just give you a few scenarios. One that sticks out in my mind is where a mother was carrying a firearm without a permit in a glove box. The mother got out of the car to go inside and left two young children in the car. The brother started playing with the firearm and shot and killed his sister. That is a direct consequence of guns in cars, allowing someone to carry without a permit. Now, if that person would have came through my class when I was teaching a carry permit class, I would have taught them to never leave a firearm unattended. So again, there are unintended consequences of laws, and I think that's something we should all think about.
Leader Lamberth, you recognized.
Mr. It probably wouldn't surprise you, though, that statistics would say that most accidental shootings, and that's a tragic, tragic situation you've described, but it is definitely the minority of any statistics that show that across the board, most accidental shootings happen in the home or at a personal business. Would that surprise you to know that that's exactly what every statistic that anybody's ever done shows?
Director Rollins?
No, that would not surprise me because the Second Amendment already allows an individual to possess a firearm in their home. So when we think about the millions and millions of firearms that we have in the United States, no one should be surprised. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about permitless carry and what the impact of permitless carry would be in the state of Tennessee.
Leader Lamberth, you're recognized for follow-up.
And similarly, Commissioner, you mentioned the number of domestic assault victims that fall victim to firearms. Again, statistics across the board show that the majority of those incidences, by definition of what domestic assault is, happen in the personal residence where they're already not required to have a permit. Would you agree with that, sir?
Director Rollins?
Well, that's complicated. So an individual that is a prohibited person, they're not legally able to possess a firearm anywhere. We know that we have a problem with convicted felons in possession of firearms. So I can't answer that because law enforcement, we can only enter your home under certain circumstances. But we're talking about individuals that will be able to carry a gun without a permit. So I don't want to debate about what happens in the home because we're not trying to address that. We're trying to address permitless carry that will allow that individual to carry with intent to go armed outside of the home, and that's what I'm most concerned about.
Leader Lamberth?
Well, Commissioner, that's exactly my point. We're talking about a penalty that is enforced outside of the home. You referenced an increase specifically in your area of domestic assault victims. And you reference this as if it has anything to do with this particular bill. This doesn't change anything about the felons being prohibited from possessing a firearm, that a domestic abuser cannot possess a firearm. This just says that someone who doesn't fall in one of those categories would not suffer a misdemeanor penalty out on the street. It doesn't change anything in the home, correct?
Director Rollins?
I don't remember me speaking anything about domestic assault victims. That may have been Commissioner Gibbons, but I don't remember if I said anything about that. So you may want to ask him to, answer that question or seek clarification.
Leader Lamberth?
Fair enough. Now I'll move on. The carry class that you provide, is that something that is provided free through the department?
Director Rollins?
No, that was years ago. I was certified to teach the carry permit course. So that was before, probably 7-8 years ago, where we taught the Department of Safety's course. So the 8-hour course where you had to come and demonstrate proficiency, you learn about the law, you learn about firearm safety. That is the course that I taught, which was a requirement for you to get that certificate before you could get your permit. And that's why we're concerned about not requiring individuals to have training before they're able to legally carry a firearm.
Leader Lamberth, you're recognized for follow-up.
And sir, you'll agree with me surely to goodness that the training that you would recommend as a certified instructor in that is regular training. It's training similar to what your officers receive, which is an annual training that is not a one and done, and for the rest of your life you're assumed to know everything that you would ever need to know to carry a firearm. Surely you would agree with me that we would encourage folks to continue to train with their firearm, continue to get out to the range with their firearm, familiarize themselves with the firearm, none of which is actually included within the law currently. But it's still your premise that the one-time 8-hour class for the next 50 years is good enough to make every single firearm carry individual that has a permit perfectly safe.
Director Rollins, you're recognized.
So I'm not 100% sure I will agree with everything you said, and I'll give you a great example. Seat belts. The law did not require us to wear seat belts, and we learned through a lot of tragedy that seat belts save lives. If I go back to the requirement to have a driver's license, I only have taken the driver's license test one time in my life. And as I renew my license, I'm able to do it. But I have demonstrated proficiency in the ability to drive a car and know the laws of the state of Tennessee. And so if I go back to the permit system, that 1-hour safety course is a certified instructor's opportunity to convince individuals that they need ongoing firearms training. The state of Tennessee requires that every single commissioned police officer attends annual in-service training, and we have to qualify every single year. So I would love for you to put some additional requirements in the current carry permit system. I definitely would love for you to not consider passing permitless carry for the very point you just brought up.
Leader Lamberth, you're recognized.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I venture a guess that would be your answer. That's why I asked the question, sir. And on this particular bill, I do want to make crystal clear that you are fully in favor of the increase in penalties, and you feel like that definitely will make your city safer, to say that we're going to punish those thieves that are stealing firearms out of vehicles and go after those folks and give you more tools to be able to keep those folks behind bars for additional time. And those aspects of this bill you're in favor of. You simply oppose doing away with the misdemeanor penalties against other citizens. Is that correct?
Director Rollins.
So I'm in 100% agreement and support of enhanced penalties for those that wish to steal firearms from vehicles. Let me make it perfectly clear. I'm opposed to a permitless carry. We have an excellent permit system. I think it is a model, and I think it's one that we should maintain. And if an individual wants to carry a firearm, that they should be able to go forth and get a permit. You've already made it easier for an individual to get a permit. So that has not even sunset. So my recommendation is that we put this off. We focus all of our attention on coronavirus, because we know today firearms violence and the coronavirus epidemic is killing Tennesseans. We know that some of the traffic fatalities we're having is killing Tennesseans. And I venture to say that if this is passed in its present form, we will experience more death in Tennessee and move from number 3 to number 1. And I think that's a statistic that none of us want to possess.
Thank you, Director Rollins. Next on the list, I do have Representative Griffey. Representative Griffey, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Rollins, for being here. Could you please just walk us through briefly how an officer on the street determines whether someone's a prohibited person if they have an encounter with an individual with a firearm?
Director
sir.
Rollins, you're recognized.
Oh, thank you. The officers have access to different databases. And the one that pops out most of all is, so let's say if an officer stops, and I'll give you a hypothetical. Officer stops an individual that's driving a car and they're 21 years of age. Well, we know that that individual cannot possess a firearm. They're not old enough. If they are convicted felons, they show as being a convicted felon, then that individual most likely is not prohibited, and it requires additional investigation. If the officer stops an individual and knows that that person is a mental consumer who has been, deemed that by the court system, and so sometimes the officer has firsthand knowledge of individuals. Other than that, as far as the deep background system that the current permit system has, the assurance that an officer has is that the individual has a valid permit and they've gone through the background check. So, the officer does not know everything, but the database is going to give them some information, and it requires investigation.
Representative Griffey, you're recognized.
Thank you. So, Director Rollins, do they typically access the TBI database for prior felony convictions or not, or whether the person has a firearm permit? Do you know?
Director Rollins.
So if the officer is presented with a carry permit, they can run it through the database and see if it's a valid carry permit. The TBI does grant access to certain information, but obviously it is not as if when you go to purchase a firearm, when you're going through additional databases that law enforcement does not have access to.
Representative Griffey.
Thank you. So Director, I'll say that you pull me over and I can't produce a permit, but you want to see whether I'm a convicted felon or not. How would the officer do that on the street?
Director Rollins.
That's an excellent point, and that's one of the problems with this current legislation is that if it does not require an individual to carry identification, the officer is just almost stuck at base zero. If a person has ID, the officer can run that individual through and see if they're a convicted felon or if that person is wanted for any particular crime. But without the presence of identification, it is a problem.
Representative Griffey.
Thank you. And so Director Rollins, are they accessing a local database for prior felony conviction, or are they accessing the TBI database for all felony offenders in Tennessee, typically when they run a background check on someone via the radio? Say it's a radio, they go radio into dispatch, say, can you run the checks on this guy? Warrants check, I think they call it sevens or something like that. Do you know?
Director Rollins.
So I won't sit here and tell you I'm a ties expert and that I remember all the different codes that an officer has access to when they run the person through an ENCIC, but it's enough to at least help the officer in the investigative process to see if the individual has a valid carry permit, if the individual has a valid ID, and they see if the individual is wanted, or they can see if the person is a convicted felon and may be a prohibited person. So at minimum, we require that if the officer thinks a person is a prohibited person, it requires additional investigation, and they will transport that individual to our bureau and make sure that we access additional databases before we take any arrest or other additional action.
Representative Griffey.
Thank you. So Director, I'm trying to determine, does the officer there on the street, are they able to radio in and have dispatch contact the TBI database to see whether someone's a convicted felon or whether they're a prohibited person based upon a determination of a mental disability or something, that they're prohibited from having a firearm? I want to make sure Memphis Police Department officials can access the TBI database there on the street. That's what I'm trying to determine.
Director Rollins.
So I think I understand what you're saying. So I'm in 100% agreement with you. If this body was open to allowing law enforcement to access that database. So the officer can go in the system and see if they can see their criminal history. And if the criminal history reveals, and if it's updated, because remember that all these records have to be updated and uploaded to the system. So there's no guarantee that a prohibited person is indicated that way in the system unless the law enforcement agency has actually entered that information into the system. So there is no 100% way to find out. But I think that I'm in agreement with you that law enforcement should have access to these additional databases.
Representative Griffey, you're recognized.
And Director Rollins, so I'm trying to, Memphis Police Department officers are able to access through the radio or whatever, the TBI database to determine whether someone has a prior felony conviction, whether in this state or somewhere else. Can you give me yes or no on that, please?
Again, I think I said I'm not a ties expert, so without having a manual in front of me or, some of the experts that actually manage and train, I do not want to say specifically, and I wish that you would allow me to get that answer to you. I regret that I'm not prepared to answer that question.
Representative Griffey.
Thank you, and thank you, Director Rollins, for that. And if you don't have access, I'll be more than willing to work with you so the officers do have access to that database, because I think it's important to have the information. Can you tell me, does Memphis police officers currently use body cameras?
Yes.
Director Rollins.
Yes.
Okay. And there's nothing that prevents the officers from having a voluntary encounter with a citizen to ask them questions, their name, whether they have a license for the firearm or anything like that currently?
Director Rollins.
Currently, the law allows for law enforcement to ask an individual that is carrying a firearm to present their permit. With the change, if it is passed, it would not allow law enforcement to ask that individual.
Representative Griffey.
They would still be able to approach an individual and have a voluntary encounter with someone. Hey, tell me your name, please. That would still be legal. This law is not going to do anything about that, is there?
Director Rollins.
This law will not on surface, however, If it is a Terry-type stop, or let's say a casual encounter, a voluntary stop, that individual can walk away whenever they want to. So if absence of probable cause that that individual is involved in some type of criminal behavior, law enforcement cannot just arbitrarily stop an individual.
Thank you, Director Rollins. Any other questions for our witness before we move on to the next? Director Rollins, thank you again for your testimony before this committee, and thank you for your service to our country, sir.
Thank you.
Next up,